The handcuffs were cold. That was the detail Margaret Hollis would remember for years afterward, not the faces of the officers, not the gasps of her neighbors gathering on their porches in the pale, Tuesday morning light, not even the sound of her own granddaughter screaming from the front door. It was the cold. The shocking, biting cold of steel against her wrists, as though the metal itself had been stored in some frozen place designed to strip the last warmth from a person's dignity. "Ma'am, you need to stop resisting." "I'm not resisting," Margaret said quietly. "I'm 63 years old, and I have arthritis in both hands. You're hurting me." The younger officer, he couldn't have been older than 25, glanced at his partner, uncertain. But the older one, a broad-shouldered man with a jaw that looked carved from impatience, tightened his grip on her arm and guided her down the porch steps. "Margaret Hollis, you are under arrest for the theft of funds from the Briarwood Community Trust in the amount of $87,000. You have the right to remain silent." The words floated around her like debris in a flood. She heard them. She understood them. But they did not make sense. They could not make sense, because Margaret Hollis had not stolen a single cent from anyone, anywhere, in all her life. "Grandma." Lily's voice cracked open the morning like a gunshot. 14 years old, still in her pajamas, her dark hair wild from sleep, she came running barefoot down the driveway. "Grandma, what's happening? What are they doing to you?" Margaret turned her head. She kept her face calm, the way she had learned to keep it calm through decades of difficulty. Through the death of her husband. Through raising her son alone. Through taking in her granddaughter when her son's addiction swallowed him whole. She had practiced this face, this mask of composure, until it became something close to armor. "Lily, sweetheart. Go back inside. Call your Aunt Ruth. Tell her what's happened. I'll be home before dinner." She would not be home before dinner. She would not be home for 3 days. The squad car smelled of disinfectant and old vinyl. Margaret sat in the back seat with her hands cuffed behind her, her shoulders aching, watching her neighborhood scroll past the window. Mrs. Carmichael stood at her mailbox, mouth open. David Park, who she'd known for 20 years, turned away, actually turned his back as the car passed. And just before they rounded the corner, she saw Janet Fielding, the woman she had considered her closest friend, standing on her porch with her phone raised, recording. Recording. Margaret closed her eyes. At the Briarwood police station, they processed her like she was any other suspect. Fingerprints. Photograph. Personal items catalogued and sealed in a plastic bag, her reading glasses, her house keys, a worn leather wallet containing $11 and a photograph of Lily as a baby. They put her in an interrogation room with buzzing fluorescent lights and a table that wobbled when she rested her hands on it. She sat there for 2 hours before anyone came. When the door finally opened, it was Detective Sergeant Paul Emery, a man Margaret recognized from town. He'd spoken at the Briarwood High School Career Day 2 years earlier. He'd seemed kind then, telling the children about justice and integrity. He did not seem kind now. He sat across from her, opened a manila folder, and spread documents on the table without looking at her face. "Mrs. Hollis, I'm going to be straightforward. We have bank records showing regular transfers from the Briarwood Community Trust account into a personal account bearing your name. Over the past 11 months, these transfers total $87,400. That's impossible. The account is registered to your name. Your social security number. Your home address." Margaret stared at the documents. She could see the numbers, the account details, and yes, her name, printed in clean digital type. Margaret A. Hollis. Her address on Elm Court. But she had never opened this account. She had never authorized these transfers. She had never even seen these documents before this moment. "Detective Emery, I have served as volunteer treasurer of the Briarwood Community Trust for 9 years. I have balanced every ledger by hand. I have submitted every report on time. I have never taken so much as a penny that wasn't mine." Emery's expression didn't change. "The evidence is quite clear, Mrs. Hollis. The evidence is a lie. He studied her for a long moment. Then he closed the folder. You'll have the opportunity to present your defense. In the meantime, you'll be held until your arraignment. Held? The word dropped through her stomach. You mean, jail? You're putting me in jail? Given the amount involved, the judge has concerns about flight risk. Flight risk? Her voice cracked, and she hated herself for it. I've lived in the same house for 31 years. I drive a 2009 Honda Civic with 160,000 miles on it. Where exactly do you imagine I would flee to? But Detective Emery was already standing, already leaving, already closing the door behind him. And Margaret Hollis, retired schoolteacher, grandmother, volunteer, woman who had never received so much as a parking ticket in 6 decades of life, was led to a holding cell where she would spend the night on a thin mattress beneath a wool blanket that smelled of bleach and despair. She did not sleep. She lay in the half-dark, listening to the distant sounds of the station, phones ringing, doors closing, muffled voices. And she thought about the community trust. She had joined it almost a decade ago, when Harold Chen, the original founder, had asked her to help manage the finances. The trust funded small but vital things, after-school programs, meals for homebound seniors, scholarships for local kids. It was the kind of quiet, essential work that never made headlines but held a community together like stitches in a wound. She thought about who had access to the accounts. Harold was gone now, passed away 2 years ago. That left the current board, herself, Janet Fielding, and Richard Price, the board chairman. Richard, who ran the largest real estate firm in Briarwood. Richard, who drove a new car every year and had recently built a second home on the lake. Richard, who had nominated Margaret for treasurer in the first place. A cold sensation moved through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the cell. The next morning, her court-appointed attorney, a harried young woman named Dana Kowalski who clearly had too many cases and too little time, explained the situation with blunt efficiency. The prosecution has bank records, transfer logs, and digital signatures. The account is in your name. It's a strong circumstantial case. It's a fabrication. Mrs. Hollis, I believe you. But believing you and proving your innocence are two very different things. We need to find out who actually opened that account, and we need evidence. Do you have any idea who might want to frame you? Margaret thought of Richard Price's smile, always wide, always warm, always with something moving behind his eyes that she could never quite name. She thought of how, 6 months ago, he had insisted on moving the trust's banking to a new institution. How he had handled the transition himself. How he had told her not to worry about the details. Don't worry about the details, Margaret. You do so much already. Let me handle the boring stuff. I might, she said slowly. But I can't prove anything yet. Dana Kowalski nodded. Then we need to work fast, because the town isn't waiting for proof. She was right. By the time Margaret posted bail on the 3rd day, Aunt Ruth mortgaging her own small home to cover it, the damage was already spreading. The Briarwood Herald had run the story with her mugshot on the front page. Her photographs, gray-haired, exhausted, bewildered, stared out from every newsstand and shared post on social media. The headline read, "Trusted Treasurer Accused of Stealing $87,000 from Community Fund." And when Margaret finally walked back through her own front door, Lily was sitting at the kitchen table with tears running down her face, holding her phone. "Grandma," she whispered, "everyone at school is saying you're a thief." Margaret set down her purse. She walked to the table. She sat beside her granddaughter. And she took Lily's face gently in both her aching, arthritic hands. "Then everyone at school is wrong," she said. "And we are going to prove it." But even as she spoke those words with all the conviction she could summon, she saw the doubt flickering in Lily's eyes, not doubt about her grandmother's honesty, but doubt about whether the truth would be enough. And somewhere across town, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message from Janet Fielding, her oldest friend, the woman she had trusted with every secret of her heart for 20 years. "I think it's best if we don't speak for a while. I'm sorry, Margaret. I just can't be associated with this." Margaret read the message twice. Then she set the phone face down on the table. She did not cry. She had forgotten how. The weeks that followed were a master class in isolation. Margaret had read once that when a person is publicly accused, the world doesn't wait for a verdict. The accusation becomes the verdict in the minds of everyone who hears it. She understood that now in a way no book could have taught her. The phone stopped ringing. Not gradually, it simply stopped, as though someone had severed a wire. The women she'd volunteered with at the church food pantry for 12 years did not call to ask how she was. The couple next door, whose daughter Margaret had tutored in math for free through an entire summer, no longer waved when they pulled into their driveway. At the grocery store, people studied their shopping lists with sudden fascination as she passed. Only Ruth remained. Ruth, her late husband's sister, a plain-spoken woman of 70 who had driven 40 minutes from Milford to stay with them. Ruth, who had put her own home at risk without a moment's hesitation. "Don't you dare thank me again," Ruth said one evening, washing dishes at the kitchen sink while Margaret dried. "Frank would have done the same if he were alive, and you know it. That man adored you. Frank has been gone 9 years. Doesn't mean he stopped adoring you." Margaret smiled, a small, tired smile, and placed a plate in the cupboard. Through the window above the sink, she could see the backyard garden she had tended for 3 decades. The roses were blooming despite everything, indifferent to human cruelty. She envied them. "Ruth, can I ask you something? You're going to whether I say yes, or not. Do you think Richard Price did this?" Ruth turned off the faucet. She dried her hands slowly and turned to face Margaret. "I think Richard Price is the kind of man who smiles at you while he's measuring you for a coffin. I've thought that since the day I met him. But thinking it and proving it are different animals." Margaret nodded. She had been thinking the same thing, turning it over and over in her mind like a stone in a polishing tumbler. The timeline made sense. Richard had pushed for the bank transition 6 months ago. He had access to all her personal information through the trust's files, social security number, address, date of birth. Everything needed to open a fraudulent account. But why? The community trust managed modest funds, never more than $150,000 in any given year. Richard Price was wealthy. His real estate firm handled multi-million-dollar developments. Why would a man like that steal $87,000 from a community charity? Unless the money wasn't the point. Margaret sat at the kitchen table that night, long after Ruth and Lily had gone to bed, and she opened the old filing cabinet in the hallway where she kept every document related to the trust. 9 years of records. Ledgers she had balanced by hand. Bank statements she had reviewed. Meeting minutes she had typed herself. She started from the beginning and read every page. It took her 4 nights. 4 nights of reading by lamplight until her eyes burned and her back ached, drinking cold coffee and marking pages with sticky notes. And on the 4th night, at 2 in the morning, she found it. It was a discrepancy so small it would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't spent 9 years memorizing these numbers. A property donation recorded in the trust's assets 3 years ago, a parcel of land on the east side of town, donated by a retired couple named the Warrens. The parcel had been appraised at the time of donation at $40,000. Margaret remembered it clearly. She remembered the Warrens, kind people who had wanted to give something back to the community. But in a subsequent filing, one Margaret had not prepared, one that bore Richard's signature, the same parcel was listed with a revised appraisal of $380,000. Margaret's hands went still on the paper. She checked the county records online. The parcel was now part of a proposed development zone, a new commercial district that Richard Price's own firm had been contracted to build. The community trust had been used. Not for $87,000. For something much, much larger. The inflated property value had been used as collateral in a development loan, a loan that enriched Richard's firm by millions. And when the numbers eventually wouldn't add up, when auditors started asking questions, Richard needed someone to blame. He needed a thief. A convenient, credible thief. And who better than the quiet, aging volunteer who handled the books? Margaret sat in the dark kitchen and felt something move inside her, not anger, not yet. Something older and harder than anger. A reckoning. The next morning, she called Dana Kowalski. I found something. I need you to come see this. Dana arrived within the hour. She sat at Margaret's kitchen table and examined the documents with growing intensity, her coffee going cold as she turned page after page. Mrs. Hollis, do you understand what this means? I understand that Richard Price has been using the community trust as a personal financial instrument for years, and that he framed me to cover his tracks. This could be massive. But we need more than your paper trail. We need the bank to confirm the fraudulent account wasn't opened by you. We need the digital forensics on those transfer authorizations. I know what we need. Margaret's voice was quiet but firm. And I know who might help us get it. She was thinking of Harold Chen's son, Michael. Harold, the trust's founder, had died 2 years ago, but Michael was an forensic accountant in the city. More importantly, Michael had once told Margaret, at his father's funeral, that he had never trusted Richard Price. My father was too good to see it, Michael had said, his eyes red from grief. But that man is a parasite in a tailored suit. Margaret had thought, at the time, that it was grief talking. Now she knew it was precision. She called Michael that afternoon. He answered on the second ring, and when she explained what she'd found, the silence on the other end of the line lasted so long she thought the call had dropped. Mrs. Hollis, he said finally, and his voice was thick with something she recognized, the particular sound of a man whose worst suspicion has just been confirmed. My father tried to flag irregularities before he died. He mentioned it to me once, near the end. He said something wasn't right with the accounts, but he was too sick to pursue it. I always wondered if. He stopped. I'll be in Briarwood tomorrow. Margaret hung up the phone and stood at the kitchen window. The roses were still blooming. A cardinal sat on the fence post, its red body vivid against the weathered gray wood. She should have felt hope. Instead, she felt a vast and terrible sadness, for Harold, who had died with the weight of an unfinished suspicion, for the Warrens, whose generous donation had been twisted into a tool for fraud, for the community programs that had been slowly starved of funds while Richard Price built his lake house and drove his new cars. And for herself. For the 9 years she had given, every Tuesday and Thursday evening, balancing books and writing reports and believing she was doing something good. All while being groomed, without knowing it, to take the fall. That evening, as Margaret was watering the garden, a car pulled up to the curb. Janet Fielding's silver Lexus. Margaret watched as Janet sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, before finally stepping out. Margaret. Janet's voice was strained. She stood on the sidewalk like a woman approaching a cliff edge. I need to talk to you. You told me you couldn't be associated with me. Janet flinched. I know. I know what I said. And I've hated myself every day since. She took a shaky breath. Richard came to see me. The day after your arrest. He told me, he said the evidence was overwhelming, that you'd been stealing for years, and that anyone who stood by you would be investigated too. He said, her voice broke. He said he could make sure I was named as an accomplice if I didn't cooperate. Margaret set down the watering can. He scared me, Margaret. I was afraid. And I am so deeply, deeply ashamed. The silence between them stretched across 20 years of friendship, birthday dinners and hospital visits and late-night phone calls, and shared grief and shared laughter. 20 years of trust, severed by one man's calculated threat. What exactly did Richard ask you to do, Janet? Janet's eyes filled with tears. He asked me to confirm to the police that I'd seen you making personal purchases that seemed beyond your means. I told them, God forgive me, I told them I'd noticed you wearing expensive jewelry. I've never owned expensive jewelry in my life. I know. Janet was weeping openly now. I know that. Everyone who truly knows you knows that. And I lied anyway, because I was a coward. Margaret studied her friend's face. She saw the guilt etched into every line, the sleepless nights visible in the shadows beneath her eyes, the trembling of her hands. And she made a decision, not out of softness, not out of weakness, but out of the clear-eyed understanding that she needed Janet's testimony to build her case, and that a woman consumed by guilt was a woman ready to tell the truth. "Janet," Margaret said, "are you willing to say that to a lawyer? On the record?" Janet nodded, wiping her eyes. "I'll say it to anyone who will listen. I'll say it in court." Margaret picked up the watering can and turned back to her roses. "Then come inside. There's someone I'd like you to meet." Michael Chen arrived in Briarwood on a Thursday morning carrying 2 banker's boxes of his late father's personal files and the quiet intensity of a man on a mission he'd been waiting years to begin. He set up at Margaret's dining room table, the same table where Lily did her homework and Ruth rolled out pie crust, and for 3 days, he barely moved. He cross-referenced Margaret's records with his father's notes. He pulled public filings from the county assessor's office. He obtained, through professional channels, the digital metadata on the bank account that had been opened in Margaret's name. On the 3rd evening, he sat back in his chair and removed his glasses. "The account was opened using an IP address registered to Price Development Group's office," he said. "The digital signature on the transfer authorizations was created using a software platform that Margaret has never accessed. Her email and device history confirm she's never even visited the platform's website. And the property manipulation goes deeper than the Warren parcel. I've found 3 other trust-held properties with inflated appraisals, all feeding into development loans for Price's projects." Dana Kowalski, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, stepped forward. "Total exposure? Conservatively? Richard Price has leveraged the community trust for fraudulent loans exceeding $4 million. The number hung in the air like smoke. Margaret, who had been sitting quietly through all of this, folded her hands in her lap. $4 million. Stolen from a community that raised money through bake sales and charity runs and the stubborn generosity of ordinary people. Used to fund the empire of a man who already had more than he could ever need. What do we do now? She asked. Dana and Michael exchanged a look. It was Dana who spoke. We take this to the district attorney's office. But Margaret, I need to warn you. Richard Price has friends. He has donated to every political campaign in this county for 15 years. The current district attorney played golf with him last month. This isn't going to be as simple as showing up with evidence. Then we don't go to the local DA, Michael said. We go to the state attorney general. That could take months. My trial is in 6 weeks, Margaret said. The room went quiet. 6 weeks. 6 weeks before Margaret Hollis would stand in a courtroom and face charges for a crime she didn't commit, with a town that had already convicted her watching from the gallery. There might be another way, Michael said slowly. He opened his laptop and turned it to face them. My father kept correspondence, emails between himself and the chief of police. Chief Donna Harlan. Margaret knew the name. Everyone in Briarwood did. Donna Harlan had been appointed chief of the Briarwood Police Department 4 years ago, the first woman to hold the position. She had a reputation for integrity that bordered on legend. She was also, Margaret recalled, someone who had been conspicuously absent from Margaret's arrest and processing. The arrest had been handled by detectives under Price's influence. Chief Harlan had been away at a training conference. My father and Chief Harlan had a professional relationship, Michael continued. He trusted her. He was building a case to bring to her before he got sick. These emails show that my father was suspicious of Price years ago and was gathering evidence to present to the police. He died before he could. Margaret looked at the emails on the screen. Harold's words, careful and precise, outlining his concerns, his findings, his hope that Donna Harlan would investigate. The last email was dated 3 weeks before his death. Donna, I believe something deeply wrong is happening within the trust, and I believe Richard Price is at the center of it. I'm not well enough to continue this work, but I'm not willing to let it die with me. I trust you to follow the thread. Please. For the community. Margaret felt her throat tighten. Harold Chen, dying and afraid, still trying to protect the thing he'd built. Still trying to do the right thing. We contact Chief Harlan, she said. Margaret, Dana began. We contact her. Harold trusted her. That's good enough for me. The meeting with Donna Harlan took place 4 days later, not at the police station but at Margaret's kitchen table. The chief came alone, in plain clothes, driving her personal car. She was a tall woman in her 50s, with close-cropped silver hair and dark, watchful eyes that seemed to absorb information faster than most people could speak. She listened without interruption for 45 minutes as Michael, Dana, and Janet each presented their pieces of the story. She reviewed the documents. She read Harold's emails. She studied the IP address records and the property appraisals and Janet's sworn statement about Richard Price's threat. When they finished, she sat in silence for a long time. Mrs. Hollis, she said at last, and her voice held a gravity that filled the room, I owe you an apology. You weren't here when they arrested me. No. I wasn't. And when I returned and reviewed the case file, something felt wrong. The investigation was handled too quickly. The arrest was made without my authorization. Detective Emery reported directly to the DA's office, bypassing my chain of command. She paused. I've been quietly looking into this for the past 2 weeks. What you've shown me tonight confirms what I suspected. Margaret felt something shift inside her, the first tremor of solid ground after weeks of standing on sand. What happens now? Ruth asked from the kitchen counter, where she had been listening with her arms crossed and her jaw set. Chief Harlan looked at Ruth, then at Margaret, then at the mountain of evidence spread across the dining table. What happens now is that I do my job. But I need time to do it properly. Richard Price has connections. If he's alerted too soon, evidence will disappear. I need to coordinate with the State Bureau of Investigation, get warrants, secure digital records before he can destroy them. She turned back to Margaret. Can you hold on a little longer? Margaret thought about Lily, who came home from school every day with a brave face that crumbled the moment she thought no one was watching. She thought about Ruth, who had mortgaged her home. She thought about the bruise on her wrist from the handcuffs, now faded to a pale yellow shadow that she still noticed every time she reached for a cup of coffee. I've held on this long, Margaret said. I can hold on a little longer. Chief Harlan stood and extended her hand. Margaret took it. The chief's grip was firm, her eyes steady. Harold Chen was one of the finest men I ever knew, Donna Harlan said. I failed him by not acting on his concerns before he died. I will not fail you. She left through the back door, the way she'd come, and the kitchen felt smaller without her. That night, Margaret sat on the edge of Lily's bed. Her granddaughter was reading, or pretending to read, a book she'd been on the same page of for a week. Grandma? Is it going to be okay? Margaret brushed a strand of dark hair from Lily's forehead. It's going to be the truth, sweetheart. And the truth is always better than okay. Tommy Wyatt said his dad told him you should be in prison. The names of the cruelties landed softly, as they always did when delivered by a child who didn't fully understand their weight. Margaret took a slow breath. Do you remember what I taught you about maple trees? Lily blinked. That they lose their leaves in winter but they don't die? That's right. They look bare and finished and done. But underneath the bark, everything that matters is still alive, still working, still getting ready. And when spring comes, they come back stronger than before. Margaret kissed her granddaughter's forehead. Exactly. She turned off the bedside lamp and stood in the doorway for a moment, watching Lily's silhouette settle against the pillows. Then she walked to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and sat alone in the dark. 3 weeks until the trial. 3 weeks until every lie Richard Price had constructed would either hold or shatter. She pressed her palms flat against the cool surface of the table and steadied herself. Somewhere out there, Chief Harlan was building a case. Michael Chen was finishing his father's work. Janet was preparing to speak the truth. And Margaret was still standing. Bare and finished and done to everyone who couldn't see beneath the bark. But alive. Every bit of her, alive the morning of the trial. It rained. Not a dramatic, cinematic downpour, but a steady, quiet rain, the kind that soaks into everything slowly, that you don't notice until you're already drenched. Margaret stood at her bedroom window at 5:30 in the morning, watching it fall on the roses, on the fence, on the street where she had lived for 31 years, and she thought, this is the last morning I will wake up as a woman accused. She dressed carefully. A navy blue dress, simple, clean, dignified. The small pearl earrings Frank had given her on their 20th anniversary. Sensible shoes. No makeup except a light touch of lipstick, because Frank had always said she looked beautiful in that particular shade of rose, and today she needed to carry him with her. Ruth drove. Lily sat in the back seat, wearing the serious face of a girl who has aged 5 years in 6 weeks. Dana Kowalski met them at the courthouse steps, looking more alert and confident than Margaret had ever seen her. "Are you ready?" Dana asked. "I've been ready since the moment they put the handcuffs on me." The courtroom was full. That surprised Margaret, though perhaps it shouldn't have. A small town feeds on its scandals the way a fire feeds on oxygen. She saw familiar faces in the gallery, neighbors, former colleagues, parents of children she had taught. Some looked at her with curiosity. Some with pity. A few, and this stung more than she expected, with open contempt. Richard Price was already seated behind the prosecution's table. He wore a charcoal suit and an expression of practiced concern, the face of a man who wanted the world to believe this caused him pain. He did not look at Margaret as she entered. He was speaking quietly with District Attorney Tom Brannigan, who nodded along with the comfortable familiarity of an old friend. Margaret sat at the defense table and folded her hands. She felt the eyes of the room on her back like heat from an open oven. She breathed. She waited. The proceedings began with the prosecution's case, and it was exactly what Margaret expected, efficient, clinical, and built entirely on the fabricated evidence Richard had constructed. Bank records. Transfer logs. Digital signatures. Detective Emery took the stand and presented his findings with the mechanical certainty of a man who has never questioned whether he might be wrong. And then it was the defense's turn. Dana Kowalski stood. "Your Honor, the defense calls Michael Chan." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Michael walked to the stand with his father's calm precision, carrying a binder of documents that represented 2 years of unfinished work, finally completed. For 40 minutes, he dismantled the prosecution's case piece by piece. He presented the IP address analysis proving the fraudulent account was opened from Price Development Group's office. He showed the metadata on the digital signatures, demonstrating they were created using software Margaret had never accessed. He laid out the property manipulation scheme, the inflated appraisals, the fraudulent loans, the millions funneled through the trust and into Richard Price's developments. The courtroom grew very quiet. The kind of quiet that precedes an earthquake. Richard Price's expression did not change, but Margaret, who had spent 9 years sitting across from this man at board meetings, studying his face while he studied spreadsheets, saw the nearly imperceptible tightening around his eyes. The first crack in the mask. Then Dana called Janet Fielding. Janet walked to the stand the way a person walks toward a confession booth, slowly, heavily, with the weight of what she was about to say pressing on her shoulders like a physical burden. She was sworn in. She sat. She looked at Margaret, one long, searching look, and then she began. She told the court about Richard's visit the day after Margaret's arrest. About his threats. About the lie she had told the police regarding Margaret's supposed expensive jewelry. Her voice shook but did not break, and when the prosecution attempted to discredit her on cross-examination, suggesting she was fabricating her testimony to help a friend, Janet straightened in her chair and said, with a clarity that silenced the room, "I have already told one lie in this matter, and it nearly destroyed a woman who has been nothing but good to me and to this entire community. I am done lying. What I am telling you now is the truth, and I will swear to it on anything you put in front of me." The judge, the Honorable Patricia Okafor, a woman with 30 years on the bench and no patience for theatrics, watched the proceedings with the sharp, assessing gaze of someone who has seen every variety of human deception and has long since stopped being surprised by any of it. But what happened next surprised everyone. The courtroom doors opened, and Chief of Police Donna Harlan entered, followed by 2 agents from the State Bureau of Investigation. She walked down the center aisle with the measured stride of a woman who has spent weeks preparing for this exact moment, carrying a folder that she handed to the judge's clerk. "Your Honor," Chief Harlan said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, "I am requesting an immediate recess." The Briarwood Police Department, in coordination with the State Bureau of Investigation, has completed an independent investigation into the Briarwood Community Trust matter. We have obtained warrants, seized financial records from Price Development Group, and secured digital evidence that conclusively identifies Richard Price as the individual responsible for the fraudulent bank account, the unauthorized fund transfers, and a broader scheme involving the manipulation of charitable assets for personal financial gain totaling in excess of $4 million. The earthquake arrived. The gallery erupted. Judge Okafor banged her gavel, once, twice, 3 times. Richard Price was on his feet, his composure finally shattered, turning to his attorney with wide, frantic eyes. District Attorney Brannigan had gone pale, his comfortable alliance with Price suddenly a liability he could feel closing around him like a trap. "Order." Judge Okafor's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "I will have order in this courtroom." She looked at Chief Harlan. "Chief, is the state prepared to file charges?" "Richard Price is being placed under arrest as we speak, Your Honor. Additionally, we have referred evidence of prosecutorial misconduct to the State Ethics Board regarding the handling of this case." Brannigan's face went from pale to gray. Judge Okafor turned to Margaret. Her expression, which had been stern and impassive throughout the proceedings, softened, just slightly, just enough. "Mrs. Hollis, please stand." Margaret stood. Her knees ached. Her hands trembled. But she stood straight, the way she had taught her students to stand when they presented their work, with respect for themselves and for the moment. "In light of the evidence presented and the ongoing state investigation, all charges against you are dismissed. You are free to go, with the profound apology of this court." The sound that moved through the courtroom was not applause. It was something deeper, a collective exhale, a release of held breath, the sound of a community confronting the recognition that it had turned its back on one of its own. Margaret closed her eyes. She felt Lily's arms around her waist before she heard her. She felt Ruth's hand on her shoulder. She felt Dana Kowalski's quiet, fierce satisfaction radiating beside her. And then she opened her eyes, and she saw Chief Donna Harlan walking toward her. The chief stopped directly in front of Margaret. The courtroom had gone silent again, a different kind of silence now, charged not with judgment but with witness. Everyone was watching. Donna Harlan looked at Margaret for a long moment. Then, slowly and deliberately, she lowered herself to one knee. "Mrs. Hollis," she said, and her voice was rough with an emotion she made no effort to hide, "Harold Chun asked me to protect this community, and I failed. I failed him and I failed you. The institution I lead put handcuffs on an innocent woman and left her to face this alone for weeks. No dismissal of charges can undo that. No apology is sufficient." She paused. "But I am offering one anyway. On behalf of the Briarwood Police Department, and on behalf of myself, I am sorry. And I give you my word that nothing like this will happen in my jurisdiction again." The courtroom was absolutely still. Margaret looked down at this woman, this strong, proud woman, kneeling before her on the hard courtroom floor, and she felt something break open inside her that she had kept sealed shut for 6 weeks. Not anger. Not bitterness. Something luminous and painful and ancient, the feeling of being seen, truly seen, after a long period of invisibility. She reached down and took Donna Harlan's hand. "Stand up, Chief," Margaret said softly. "You don't owe me a knee. You owe me the truth, and you've given it. That's enough." Donna Harlan stood. She nodded once, sharply, and Margaret saw the brightness in her eyes before she turned away. Richard Price was escorted from the courtroom in handcuffs. He did not look at Margaret as he passed. He looked at the floor, at his expensive shoes on the worn courthouse carpet, and Margaret thought he looked, for the first time in the years she had known him, exactly like what he was, a small man who had mistaken cruelty for cleverness and power for worth. She felt nothing for him. Not satisfaction. Not triumph. Not even anger. She felt the absence of him, the lifting of a weight she had carried without realizing how heavy it was. Outside the courthouse, the rain had stopped. The sun was breaking through in long, golden shafts that turned the wet pavement into mirrors. Margaret walked down the courthouse steps with Lily on one side and Ruth on the other, and she stopped at the bottom, tilting her face upward to feel the warmth. People approached her. Some cried. Some apologized. Mrs. Carmichael from the mailbox. David Park, who had turned away. Others she barely knew, who had read the headlines and believed the worst and were now confronted with their own complicity. Margaret accepted each apology with grace, not because she had forgotten the hurt, but because she understood something about forgiveness that only decades of living can teach. It is not a gift you give to the person who wronged you. It is a door you open for yourself, so you can walk through and keep going. Janet found her in the parking lot. They stood face to face, two women with 20 years between them and a wound that would take time to fully heal. "I don't know if you can ever forgive me," Janet said. Margaret considered this honestly. "I don't know either," she said. "But I'd like to find out. Come to dinner on Sunday." Janet's face crumbled with relief. She nodded, unable to speak, and walked to her car. Ruth drove them home. The town scrolled past the windows, the same streets, the same houses, the same maples lining the boulevard. But something had shifted. Not in the town itself, but in Margaret's relationship to it. She had been stripped down to her barest self, no reputation, no standing, no assumed goodness to protect her, and she had survived. More than survived. She had stood in the center of the storm and refused to become something she was not. At home, Lily went to change out of her court clothes, and Ruth put the kettle on, and Margaret walked out to the backyard garden alone. The roses were heavy with rain, their petals bowed but unbroken. She touched one gently, watching the water droplets tremble and fall. She thought of Harold Chen, who had planted the first seed of truth and hadn't lived to see it bloom. She thought of Frank, steady and kind, who would have sat beside her through every moment of this and never once doubted her. She thought of her son, somewhere in the difficult terrain of his recovery, and she sent a silent hope in his direction, the way she always did, like a prayer released without certainty but without surrender. And she thought of Lily, of 14 years old, watching her grandmother be arrested and humiliated and abandoned and doubted, and then watching her grandmother stand in a courtroom and be declared innocent. What had that taught her? Margaret hoped it was this, that the truth is not always fast, and it is not always loud, but if you hold on to it with both hands and refuse to let go, it will outlast every lie ever told about you. The back door opened. Lily appeared, now in jeans and a sweater, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. "Grandma? The tea's ready." Margaret looked at her granddaughter. At the strong, open, still-forming face of a girl who had carried more weight this year than most people carry in a decade, and who had not broken. "I'll be right in, sweetheart." Lily went inside. The screen door closed with its familiar gentle slap. The sound of the kettle whistling. The sound of Ruth humming something tuneless and comfortable. The sound of home, still here, still holding. Margaret turned her face to the sky one more time. The clouds were moving east, pulling apart like curtains, and behind them the blue was deep and limitless and patient, the way the sky always is, after the rain has done its work and moved on. She went inside. She sat at her kitchen table. She drank her tea. And for the first time in 6 weeks, Margaret Hollis felt the warmth reach all the way through.